Welcome back to the History Fix, and this episode we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to step aside from the time sequence in order to talk a little bit about how history works in a general sense. And I want to define that historical process, that historical mechanism, if you like, in terms of three different engines or motors, as I like to call them. And it's the interaction really of these three different engines or motors that drive the historical process. And I'm going to list them and explain them and try and illustrate them from some of the history which we have already looked at together. The first of those motors is technological change. And we have to be very careful when we talk about technological change that we don't think in terms of some kind of technological determinism, and we imply that everything really is being driven by the development of technology. That's a big idea around today and is very misleading. A lot of people argue that technology on its own can solve all of our problems. But what is certainly true is that if you look at the long term in history, we can see a gradual development in the ability of human beings to create wealth and solve problems and provide themselves with the things that they need, a gradual development of that through improvements in technology. Here's one very obvious example of that. We've talked about the role of iron in prehistory, the way in which the introduction of iron leads to huge increases in the productivity of labour. So we've got that example already in place. There are lots of other examples where major technological innovations make a huge difference to the productivity of labour. What's key about these big advances, the introduction of iron, the introduction of the plough, the introduction of steam power, the introduction of modern communications technology, and so on, whatever example you choose, if it's a technological innovation that is widespread, that is useful, that raises the productivity of labour, that makes it much easier for human beings to create the wealth and provide the services that they need, so much so that it becomes embedded in everyday practice, everyday experience. It becomes something that lots of people know about. It becomes something that lots of people are able to use. Once that happens, it doesn't get lost. In other words, it's a permanent gain, a permanent advance, and we get a gradual accumulation over time of skill, of knowledge, of technology, of expertise, so that we become increasingly capable as a species of creating the things that we need to live a good life. Now that is one of the motors, one of the engines of history. Here is a second one. And again, we've already touched on it in some of the things that we have said about what's happening in prehistory and in antiquity. It's the way in which, as a surplus of wealth is created, following on from the agricultural revolution with the development of farming and so on, a surplus is created, and that surplus is increasingly appropriated by ruling classes, ruling elites, and we see a whole series of them running through the last 5,000 years of human history, different kinds of elite in different places, establishing systems of exploitation where they're taking the wealth that's being produced by working people, accumulating that wealth themselves at the top of society, using it in part for maintaining a high standard of living, luxury living among the elite, partly investing it in great monuments, partly in the building of cities and so on, if we're thinking about the ancient world, but also crucially using that surplus and elite control over surplus to engage in competition with other elites, crucially in the form of armies and warfare. So that if we look at what is happening through the 5,000 years of class society, society based on exploitation, society where the elite is creaming off the bulk of the surplus, we are looking at 5,000 years of armies, of warfare, of organized violence, where different elites compete with each other for control of resources, control of territory, control over labor, control over wealth, and so on. And that's a major driver of the historical process. Let's sum it up in these terms. It's political and military competition, and latterly, if we're thinking about modern capitalism, economic competition as well between rival elites, however they're organized, in tribes, in states, in kingdoms, in empires, competing capitalist corporations nowadays, and competing nation states, competing empires nowadays. That's a major driver, a second major driver of the historical process. Here's the third one. Crucially important for our story is that this class society that we first see clearly represented in the archaeological and historical record in certain places about 5,000 years ago. This class society where there's a division between a minority elite at the top and a mass of ordinary working people producing the wealth of society at the bottom, that gives rise to tension between the social classes at the base of society, resentment about the experience of exploitation in the form of taxation, in the form of rents, in the form of labor services, in the form of enslavement, resentment about exploitation, resentment about oppression, the oppression of slaves, the oppression of women, the oppression of racial minorities and other forms of oppression in society, the tensions that accumulate as a result of a class society based on exploitation and oppression, periodically produces eruptions of resistance from below, eruptions of class struggle from below. And an example of that we've talked about already is the way in which in a particular part of the world, and I'm thinking now about ancient Greece, and in particular about ancient Athens, where we talked about the development of democracy. In that part of the world, in the 6th and the 5th century BC, we saw a class struggle against an imperial system, initially against the Persian Empire, but also against aristocrats inside Greek society, inside Athenian society, a class struggle powered by a class of farmers, citizen farmers, who were organized as a citizen militia able to defeat the Persian Empire, and a citizen militia able to defeat their own aristocratic landowning class and create a form of democracy. And when I talked about Athens, I talked about how that golden age of Athenian cultural achievement was based upon the creation of the democracy. And what I'm now stressing is the way in which that democracy was the outcome of an internal struggle between classes. We've got three key engines or motors of history: the accumulation of knowledge and skill and technology to improve our capacity to create wealth, the way in which surpluses are creamed off by ruling classes, and those surpluses are then used to engage in political and military competition, are effectively wasted, and the struggle between classes not between rival elites, but between classes, as the mass of people at the base of society periodically organise themselves in such a way that they can fight for a bigger share, and in some cases, through revolutionary change, a complete transformation in the way in which society is run. Those three great motors of the historical process and the interaction between them, the complex interaction between them, we're going to encounter again and again in future episodes of The History Fix. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at The History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.